live.
So, welcome to the ArgLab Research Colloquium, a permanent series of research seminars organized by the Reasoning and Argumentation Lab within the Nova Institute of Philosophy, Universidade Nova de Lisboa. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our guest for today, Professor Jos Hornikx from Radboud University. Jos Hornikx is a professor of international business communication within the Department of Language Studies and the Department of Language and Communication. He does research in the field of persuasive argumentation, reasoning, and multilingual advertising, paying a special attention to the role played by foreign languages and culture. He published many works in leading journals for the field of philosophy, communication, argumentation, and advertising. I'd like just to quickly mention one article I found particularly inspiring, titled Comparing the Actual and Expected Persuasiveness of Evidence Types, How Good Are Laypeople at Selecting Persuasive Evidence, published in 2008 on Argumentation. And also one of the most recent ones, Jos co-authored and published this year in the Journal of Advertising, and titled The Importance and Use of Normative Criteria to Manipulate Argument Quality. His presentation today is on argumentation schemes put to a test, empirical research on what schemes mean to lay people. So Professor Jos Hornikx, thank you for accepting our invitation and for being virtually here today with us.
Thank you, Maria, and also Dima for the invite. I'm really happy to share this research with you today. And as we said in the introduction, it's strange to be together online and to be a part or to watch this from several places. But it also gives the opportunity to talk about this and to discuss this work. So I think it's easier. I think you ask people to just ask questions after the talk. But if you have urgent questions, you can also interrupt me, because there is no need to write down the question and forget it half an hour later. So just ask me a question if you want to. I suspect that everyone can unmute. Is that correct, Dima? Okay, yeah. So I'll share my screen with you. Yeah, I guess you can now see the first page of this presentation with the title that Maria just pronounced. So it's about argumentation schemes as a focus of research, and my work on argumentation as a cognitive perspective. So I really like to share, to combine both the humanities perspective on argumentation schemes on the one hand, and the mostly empirical research from a more cognitive perspective of what people actually, how they perceive arguments, how they may be persuaded by arguments, how they produce arguments. And argumentation schemes are a very fruitful theme to combine both perspectives. So what I want to do in this presentation is to discuss two empirical studies under the umbrella of this question: what people actually do with argumentation schemes. And yeah, so the starting point of this work has to do with Mercier and Sperber's groundbreaking work, I think, on the argumentation theory of reasoning, saying collecting a lot of theoretical and empirical research, demonstrating that people have the capacity to reason with arguments, and that we all can do this. That there's a very basic human capacity. So that as humans, we all share capacities, maybe biological or physical, but actually reasoning as a capacity is also very much interesting, and actually that gives much weight to what we all do in our research. And it's even so fundamental that even children seem to have this capacity from early on. So this is a study with Mercier's team where they showed that children actually with the age of 2 years old already are able to distinguish between strong arguments on the one hand and circular arguments on the other. And that's I find that really fascinating. I mean, it's very difficult to determine at what age we as humans learn to argue or learn to reason. But this study at least shows that from the early stages, people learn to reason with arguments. And that's also one of the fundamentals of this theory. It's that we reason not because we want to argue with other people, but we want it has argumentative purposes, and they make a distinction between the case that we produce arguments, as we often do, when we are pretty lazy at producing arguments, because we tend to, so to speak, invent arguments for the standpoints that we already have. And we all have different standpoints, but it's difficult to trace back what the arguments were that back up our standpoints. But so if you ask me why I agree with the current corona regulation in the Netherlands, I really have to think about my arguments. So people have a hard task inventing arguments for themselves. But we can do this, and what we can do more easily is to evaluate arguments from others. So we have a very fine capacity to see what we think about other arguments, and to determine whether we find these arguments strong or weak. And we don't always do this objectively. You can actually say that we often do this subjectively. We assess arguments on the basis of what we believe, how we perceive the claim. If we accept the claim, we tend to say that is a strong argument. If we don't believe the claim put forward by another speaker, we tend to say that the arguments put forward are weak. So it's not necessarily the case that we do this objectively or logically or validly, but we can do this. So we have this capacity. And much of the research that underlines the work of Monsieur and Spurber comes from cognitive sciences. So this is work that's hardly related or a little bit related to what most of us have been doing, I think, from the humanities perspective. And there are some pros and cons, actually, if you think about this work. So one of the basic assets of cognitive science is that they have really strong normative frameworks. So they have very specific ideas of what should be good or what should not be good in terms of how we should reason with arguments, how we should decide, how we should judge. So they have made standards, so to speak, as standards how we should evaluate or reason or decide. There are Bayesian frameworks that could be useful. Another strong point is that they, given their frameworks, they have usually very good empirical methodologies to test their predictions, which is a strong case, I think, for cognitive science perspective to studying arguments. And there are also backdrops, at least two. So Rikan and I also wrote this a couple of years ago, that if you realize, if you try to summarize this kind of work, you realize that many arguments that have been used are the same arguments. So there are only a few cases that they have been studied. So they typically are not interested in what we usually have from the humanities, a catalog of arguments, a catalog of argumentation schemes, but they usually have, so to say, 4 or 5 or 6 prototypical logical arguments that they are interested in. So that's really a weak point of this kind of work. And it's also based, this is changing now in the last years, but they've used to use formal logic as their framework to study how reasonable people are when they evaluate arguments. So so the golden standard has been formal logic, and as most of us know, this is interesting and good, but if you want to predict or if you want to transfer results from these studies to how people reason on an everyday basis, it's difficult. And those kinds of arguments are not very similar to what we see every day. So for everyday reasoning, some of these results, or maybe all of these results, are hard to transfer. So I suspect you to think that, given the pros and cons, the humanities perspective has also pros and cons, and that's certainly the case. And actually, the main point is that when we combine them together, we can actually be in a better position, I believe, to study how people reason with arguments. And I think one of the most important contributions in the last years when it comes to studying arguments has to do with not so much the formal logic, but informal logic. Most of you will be familiar with the three aspects here: acceptability, relevance, sufficiency. And one of the more specific ideas within informal logic has been the argumentation schemes perspective. Walton has published many books on this issue. He passed away beginning this year or just already a year ago. I mean, very sad news for the whole community, but we can be very happy with all his work because it's inspiring to most of us. So in this 2008 book that he published with 2 colleagues, he provides a whole catalog of different argumentation schemes, prototypical cases of arguments, and that's interesting. They suspect these to be conventional patterns of reasoning. That's I doubt this. I mean, I think I understand why they say that they are patterns of reasoning, but that's actually almost the reason, not so much the reason for this talk, but it gives it indicates very clearly the issue of what I am interested in. So you can write down argumentation schemes, you can think about distinctions and classifications, and that's all true in terms of what you suspect schemes to be, but it doesn't say that automatically those schemes may be transferred to what we as humans have in our minds. So we hope that they are conventional patterns of reasoning, but a scheme, we don't know whether the scheme represents how people reason. And I acknowledge these are 2 different questions, so I don't blame argumentation scholars interested in argumentation schemes not to do this. And it's the other way around. I'm very glad that there is so much research in this area, and Jean is with us today, and he's also one of the more prolific people working in this domain of argumentation schemes. And the more people contribute to theoretical accounts on schemes, the more people like myself can try to see how this compares to people's actual reasoning. And these research traditions in humanities focus on the content. I mean, for us, we cannot see how we can study argumentation without the content, unless you think about formal logic. But I mean, it's all about what the argument is about and how it relates to people's prior knowledge or how it relates to other arguments. So there is for us, logical, so to speak, focus on the content of arguments put forward. And we usually take into account all large sets of arguments, whether we pick examples from larger texts, whether we combine sets of arguments. I mean, the set may be large, but also our interest is large in the sense that we try to think about all kinds of potential arguments that people put forward. So there is a focus on the content of argument and also on the aspect that many arguments may be relevant for study. And then, of course, maybe this backdrop is relevant here today, is that you can write down classifications of argumentation schemes. You can compare them. I can add sub schemes, and that's in itself useful. But the question, at least for me, is how this compares to what you may call psychological reality. How real are these schemes psychologically? Is there a reflection of these schemes in people's cognitive toolbox, what people have in their minds to use when they evaluate arguments or produce arguments? So the 2 studies I present today have to do with this question, psychological reality. Let's take a look. So my idea is that people, when they grow older, develop a sort of, so to speak, a cognitive toolbox, actually a instrumentarium of elements, issues, I think elements they can use when they reason with arguments, whether they produce arguments or evaluate. They have specific tools in their mind, so they may not be aware, but they have tools to make sense of the arguments. So there must be something in our minds that we use when we evaluate everyday arguments. Otherwise, I mean, there is definitely something, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to assess the strength of an argument or the content of an argument or how it relates to other arguments. So we definitely have something in there cognitively. And what is it? And it could very well be that there is some reflection of what we call argumentation schemes in our minds. And there is a very nice metaphor in Lorenzian and Heine, a very nice paper if you want to read it, about the mind as a toolbox, and the idea that there are different kinds of tools in our mind that we use. It's a I find it a very difficult question, but also intriguing. At what point in time we as humans develop those tools? So do we develop them before 12 years old, or is there a acceleration phase between 12 and 18? For instance, it's all these questions are not solved yet, but they are important, I think. And borrowing from Lorenzo and Heine, they use these three levels of tools: the existence of tools, the use of tools, and the accessibility. And I've tried a couple years ago to apply this this idea to the existence, use, and accessibility of cognitive reflections of argumentation schemes. So with these three levels, I analyzed current approaches to empirical approaches to argumentation. So, and the summary of this analysis is shown on the next page. Are there questions? For clarification? So now I can all see. Okay, so let's move ahead with so I started. This maybe seems strange, but I start on the right hand side. So going actually, if a tool or a reflection of an argumentation scheme exists, if it exists, you may or may not use it, and whether or not you use it, it may also be accessible, come to your mind so that you can apply it. So I start from right to left, as you can see. So accessibility for me, that's production, so argument production. The capacity to produce arguments, and if you produce arguments, there has to be a sort of a catalog of different arguments in your mind, or ideas of the characteristics of these arguments. The question could be: do people use these representations when they produce arguments? And I only find one study of a former colleague 3 years ago, where they asked people to produce arguments, specifically to produce a strong and a weak argument. And they also asked people to produce a very specific type of argument. So they explained what an argument by comparison was. And they asked people to produce two arguments by comparison, one strong, one weak. And they didn't explain what weak or strong would be. And interestingly enough, participants were able to compose, to produce the two variants of the same argumentation scheme based on criteria that we have, of elements that we describe as criteria, critical questions for schemes, but that people used themselves. They didn't ask people to use a criterion, people just gave two examples of arguments, and when you analyze these arguments, it was possible to trace them back to what we call criteria for strong use of argumentation schemes. They also mentioned some criteria related to formal logica. This is relevant or not, but there is a case that this provides evidence for the idea that people are able to produce arguments with notions in their mind that we can understand as being criteria for schemes. Unfortunately, it's the only study. So the first study I will be talking about in a few minutes is related to this one, with, I hope, an improvement, with something that I hope you also see as improvement. Let's put it that way. So the second level is use. Do people use arguments or notions of argumentation schemes in practice? And for me, that's evaluation. And do people use intuitively those criteria to evaluate arguments? Once again, I suspect people to have sort of a cognitive toolbox, and for something to be a toolbox or to be a tool, it has to be, people have to use it or not. And if you confront people, if you show people arguments that we suspect, that we think are strong and weak, depending on characterizations of argumentation schemes, people should be sensitive to this difference, and people should know that what we believe to be normatively strong argument, they should be able to perceive that it's actually a good argument or a better argument than an argument that we manipulate as being normatively weak. And there is, I mean, these are just 5-6 sources, but there are many empirical studies showing that people can be sensitive to criteria for strong arguments. And still, this is, I think, intuitive. People don't usually refer to literature. I mean, will never do, but it's not so much that that we can see that they can list all those criteria very easily, but it's if they evaluate arguments, they do this largely consistently with what we as argumentation scholars hope them to do, and that they use some criteria for what we call strong or valid arguments. And the first level is the most difficult level. And so if we know that people use scheme-based criteria to produce argument and also to evaluate arguments, that they are sensitive to different quality variations. The first level 2, level 3 may imply that they also exist. And so if you use a tool, then it must exist. So maybe philosophically, if accessibility and use are empirically demonstrated, and I think existence is also demonstrated, but it feels a little bit, it's not really determined. So you'd really want to design a study to show that people that they exist, so to speak. It's as I say, it's sort of a fundamental level. The first level actually, they must exist, and if they exist, people may or may not use it. As I just said at the beginning, so people use cognitive tools to evaluate arguments when they don't have a reason to deviate from these rules. But if they have already an opinion on a specific standpoint, people may subjectively evaluate the argument because they already believe in the claim. So people don't automatically use those tools in the second phase. But I really wanted to set up 1 or 2 studies, or even more, to just try to come closer to the existence level. With maybe a philosophical question: do people have representations of schemes? So is there a study to be designed that demonstrates that they have these representations? So the evidence on the right hand side of this graph, the use and accessibility. I mean, you can perceive this and accept this as evidence, but I mean, you can make a case for saying that this is implicit evidence, that the existence level should exist, it should be there, but it's maybe hard to determine. And I really want to try to make a case for this first level. So that's what study 1 is about. So just what's the reasoning of the first study? So I suspect schemes do exist, but let's say if they are psychologically irrelevant, so if people don't have some representation of schemes in their mind, they should evaluate arguments in another way, actually maybe uniquely. So you see an argument, and if there is nothing that hints to a representation of a scheme, you may evaluate an argument based on length. A longer argument is maybe a stronger argument, or the topic. If it's something that interests you, the argument is more valid. If it's something that you don't care about, it's a weak argument. Maybe it has to do with whether you find it acceptable when you see it, or whether you find this relevant or sufficient. So these are criteria that don't bear on the content of the argument. But if there is no representation of schemes in people's minds, they should actually process an argument uniquely based on maybe these kinds of criteria. If, on the other hand, people have a representation of schemes, we could expect them to also think about similar arguments in a similar way, and to think about different arguments in a different way. And there is reason to suspect this, to predict this, and so that's why I put down this hypothesis that people's thoughts about arguments, cognitive thoughts, reflect similarities for arguments that are in the same class of schemes, and that they have different cognitive thoughts for arguments that fall in different schemes. And in order for me to try to search for evidence for this prediction, I designed a study that in the case of this presentation is now called study 1. Are there questions so far? And if not, we can move on to study 1. This goes faster than the introduction. I gave people, I'll show you in the Dutch material in a second, 12 different scenarios, each with a different topic. There were 4 schemes, as you can see. There were 3 different genres to present different ways of presenting information to people: dialogues, news reports, and just simple claiming with an argument. As you will see in the next slide, I indicated what was the claim and what was the argument to make sure that people don't turn them around, which could sometimes happen. There were 2 versions with different orders, but people also, all people saw these 12 scenarios. You can see 3, I didn't translate them, 3 examples in Dutch on the left-hand side. So you can see from the format, it's a dialogue. So there are 2 people, Peter and Jan Henk, they both they're having a discussion, and you see the underlined, so you can, you can see my mouse, this is underlined, so this is the claim, and this is the argument. And people, I explained to people that the underlined sentence was the claim, and the highlighted sentence was the argument. This is a dialogue. This is a sort of a news report with a title, and then news saying, "Oh, this is the claim," and then the argument. And in the most simple way, you just see claim and argument in Dutch, stelling and argument. So these were 3 different cases, and for each case they saw 4 topics, 4 arguments, leading up to 12 cases, 12 scenarios. So for each of the scenarios, I asked only one question. Before I made sure that there was informed consent, I explained the, so to speak, goal of the study, our interest in what people think about these issues, which is correct, but that's not the real goal, of course. I asked people to really read each text carefully, and there was only one question: what do you think of the argument? So I didn't ask about the claim. So as you will see in a minute, people also had reflections on the claim, but I really asked, what do you think of the argument? I didn't ask them why or on what grounds, but just a free task, really free task for normal people. What do you think of the argument? These were interviews with about 10-15 minutes per respondent. I had 3 research assistants who took all those interviews. They were recorded and they were coded within the last, well, the recording is not hard work, the coding is. 2 of these coders also, 2 of these assistants also coded, and none of them was aware of the research aim, which is important. So I have to say that I have not yet coded all interviews. So I coded 1/3, and the results may shift, but I don't suspect to see very different results than we will see in a minute, because they are very clear cut. But we have to wait for all the evidence before I am writing up this article for publication. So the coding scheme, we developed a coding scheme. So all people's cognitive thoughts about the 12 arguments could be related to the claim. So people could say something that we say, well, people find the claim positive, negative, credible, incredible, good, or so on a scale. So people's thoughts were classified. Some of the thoughts were about the claim. Actually, it's not interesting because we didn't ask, but people usually said something about the claim. The same thing for the argument, has the evaluation of the argument in itself. And then we also wanted to know whether people, without asking, refer to the 3 elements from a logic: sufficiency, acceptance, relevance. And then, of course, so you have to read this as follows. So if people said anything about, let's say, how desirable something was, or whether the case presented was only a unique case and that there should be more, then we based on thoughts reflecting those elements, we trace it back to a specific scheme. So whenever they said something about credibility, that's to do with the argument by authority. If they were making an issue about how comparable this was or how weakly this was as a comparison, this was traced back to the argument by analogy. So, of course, people didn't mention scheme or the issue of an argument scheme or a criterion, but they were able to. These are actually maybe the tools. So these are these may be the representations that people have. These are actually the tools that people have to analyze and evaluate arguments. So we wanted to know, do they use them? When did they use them? For which cases? And the analysis goes as follows. So we determined the percentage of people who made one remark for each of those 4 categories, and actually all categories. So the percentage you will see on the next slide have to do with how many percent of all participants made a remark in the category. There were 100 participants. They were paid for the interview, and as I said, we analyzed only 1/3 yet. And let's see what came out. So this is the main result. So these figures represent the percentage of respondents making a claim related to the criteria that are instrumental to this scenario. So how do you have to read this? We have 4 scenarios for different schemes on the left-hand side: authority, pragmatic arguments, argument by example, and by analogy. And on the right-hand side, you see remarks made by how many participants made a remark about credibility, authority, or the probability or the desirability, which is pragmatic argument. And you can see, for instance, on the left-hand side that almost 70% of the participants made a remark about credibility in the case of the argument by authority, and that also 1% made a remark about credibility when it was a pragmatic argument. But none of the participants made a remark about credibility when it comes to the example scenario and the analogy scenario. So there was nothing here. As you can see on the diagonal, this is also significant, most remarks were made for the correct scheme. And for example, so the observations people had about arguments that were not had, people saw arguments, they didn't know what kinds of arguments were, they were not indicated, but most, this is about maybe 95% or so about the remarks were to do with desirability and probability. And these are specifically the characteristics that have to do with the argument by, or the pragmatic argument. So if you translate it in terms of the hypothesis, people the thoughts they had, they formulated in the interviews, they reflect similarities for the same arguments and also differences for different arguments. So I take this as very strong evidence that people by themselves are able to formulate how they think about arguments, and that they use specific maybe tools, if we can call them tools, specifically in at the right moment for the right argument. So they are able to think about a class of arguments and formulate that, use the tools that they have at their mind. This shows that people have the tools and that they use them for different types of argumentation schemes. So actually you cannot find this if people don't have different tools for different argumentation schemes, because then it would completely be random. So this demonstrates that there is a cognitive representation in our minds that reflects the idea of argumentation schemes. On the next table you can see here, you can see this spell out for the, it's not only the argumentation schemes that we just saw, but also how many people made a remark about the claim. So this is in general. It's that almost everyone made a comment on the argument. About a quarter said something about the claim. There were 1/3 of the people made a remark about an issue related to informal logic criteria, and about 60% about an argumentation scheme. And you can see that in gray, it looks like that's the same for all 4 kinds of arguments. And that's also the case. So there is no relationship between these 4 and these 4, which means that people's use of those, the distinction between the types of thoughts is independent of the scenario, independent of the argumentation scheme. And interestingly enough, people use more, this is also significant, more thoughts based on argumentation schemes than on informal logic schemes. And that's also taken to be evidence that this is relevant. We have to underline this. So people also use issues as relevance or sufficiency to reflect their assessments of arguments, but they use much more thoughts. They have much more thoughts about tools related to the argumentation scheme. It's a stronger tool. It seems to be a stronger tool for people to evaluate arguments. So it's first examination of this question, the psychological realities, has to do with the existence of those tools, and I take this evidence to be evidence for the psychological relevance for 2 reasons. One is that people's thoughts converge for arguments from the same type of argument, and diverge when it involves different kinds of arguments, and also because people refer to those tools related to argumentation schemes much more frequently than to tools we all know to be part of the informal logic criteria. And then let's move to the second study. So this is given people, or there is evidence that people actually have this capacity to reason because of the tools they have in their minds. I also wanted to know, can people recognize that some schemes are more similar than others? As you know, there are many different schemes and sub-schemes. And this is maybe a step further. Do people are they able to do one thing, maybe distinguish between subtypes? Is it possible for people to distinguish between the types? And is it possible for them to also link critical questions to those schemes? These are elements, so these are important assets of the argumentation schemes perspective, and is it reflected in also in people's minds? Are people able to do the same thing? That was the aim of the second study. I will do this briefly. So there are issues with the scheme-based approach. Issues is a neutral word for problems. So there are problems with the approach, I believe, so at least 3. So there is overlap between schemes. So this is an example of a claim. Jack is late, that's the claim, and the argument must be a problem with the train or the other way around. And so the idea of the schemes is that if you find such an argument with a claim, for us to be able to analyze whether it's a good case or good argument, you have to first be able to identify the specific argument. And if you then look in Walton et al., there are at least 2 candidates. This one argument from sign, but also the argument from evidence or hypothesis. So how you can do this for yourself. Actually, both arguments may be in play, and it's difficult to say whether one of the 2 is better than the other. And this is not what you want schemes to look like. If schemes overlap or are sometimes similar, that's not the idea of a catalog of different schemes. The second issue has to do with subtypes that may be seen as unnecessary. So this is another example. Imagine that you see this 250 consumers say that specific product is excellent, and this seems to be a popular argument. There are many subtypes of popular arguments, and these 2 all apply. I mean, the argument of popular opinions, that's the standard case, and then this is a subtype, the position to know. I mean, and the difference is that this is just everyone in a particular group accepted, and this one says that the group is in a special position. But I mean, I would say that everyone is in a special position, because otherwise they wouldn't know. So these consumers have a special position to say something about these speakers. Maybe they have bought them, or maybe they are a fan of Sony, or maybe there must be a reason. So they, by definition, are in a special position, because otherwise they wouldn't say this. So this, again, this is not good. So these are subtypes that actually do the same thing. They can be applied to the same case, which is not what you want the schemes to work like. And the third issue has to do with the relevance of the question. So for all schemes, scholars have made up relevant critical questions that we can ask to assess the argument. And for this example, the argument to popular opinion, there are 3 critical questions, and you can say something about all 3, but let's just concentrate on the second one. And the second one reads, is there other relevant evidence available that would support the assumption not to be true? This is a critical question that's always relevant. I mean, you can always ask, is there other evidence, or is there other counter evidence? So this is a critical question, but this is a general critical question for all schemes, for all arguments, and it doesn't apply uniquely to this one. But it's that's strange. So there is there is much work on argumentation schemes. There are many catalogs, but I suspect that we can trim those catalogs down, and we can also make a case for really useful critical questions, unique critical questions that make for also a distinction between these schemes. That's a very interesting discussion. There could be talks about these issues, but there are issues with the schemes, but nevertheless, there are different schemes. And the idea is also that given that they exist in reality, is it so that people also have reflections of those differences and of those criteria in their mind? So given the reality of schemes that we just saw, we may expect people to recognize that some schemes that are related are more similar than others. So I had 2 questions in mind here. Are people able to correctly distinct subtypes? And are people able to actually link schemes to critical questions, actually maybe critical questions to schemes? So this was a difficult study in methodologically speaking, as you will see here. So we gave people 12 claims with different arguments, and these arguments are all in the same class. So they all have to do with knowledge from others. So at popular arguments, there were 6 ad popular arguments, 3 different types, 3 sufficiency to know arguments, so making up 12 different arguments. And they are similar, they are all different, let's say, from an argument by comparison, but given the theory, they are all 6 different arguments. And my question was, are people able to distinguish between arguments from the same class, see them as being together, and distinguish between arguments that are different? We operationalized those claims, so we wrote down claims based on these and the descriptions, and 2 colleagues also checked whether that was correct, which was the case. Is the operationalization correct? And we use all kinds of topics about organ donation or elections or exercising. And what people saw was this. So there were little cards, 12, and there were 2 procedures, and as you will see, the results were the same, but we asked one half of the participants, we asked them to divide the 12 arguments in 2 groups. And so as you can see, we would hope that people have the distinction between 6 and 6, which could be the case or not. So one question was divide them into 2 groups, but then you help people that there are actually 2 groups, so half of the participants were asked to divide them into groups. I mean, the group of 1 is not a group, so that you could have 6 groups of 2, but you could also have 4 groups of 3, or a group of 2, a group of 3. So that's, I mean, if you this all makes it very complicated. So I can imagine if we do this now, that we all find maybe different group selections. So that's why we decided to use both procedures, not knowing what would be best. This was a think aloud protocol. Of course, the cards were presented randomly, so that people had a different order of all those arguments. And the second part had to do with the critical questions. You can see on the right-hand side a form that we gave to participants, and this is already filled in. We asked them, we explained them what critical questions are, and on the first row, you cannot read it, but you can see at least that there are different columns. So each column represents a critical question. And these from top to bottom are the different arguments. So they were asked to indicate for each argument what critical question or what question is relevant, do you think? As you can see in this example, this participant thinks that for this argument, 5, 6, or 7 criteria are going to play. So we analyzed the distribution of critical questions over the different arguments. And part of this was also done by a second coder. Okay, 36 participants. This was quite labor intensive for the student that did this with me, to have these interviews with people, and they had to make up the different distinctions and to write down and think about where they crossed the boxes, tick the boxes. Let's take a look at the results. So do people group together? So we eventually analyzed it in a way that was feasible for us. Do people group together the 2 instantiations of the same argument? So as you know, there were 6 different types. There were 12 arguments. For each argument, there were 2 instantiations. So we made it a little bit simpler, because otherwise it actually was a difficult task, maybe even for ourselves. So we analyzed how many people were able to get the 2 same arguments together within a group. That could be a group of 3 or 4, but at least they had the 2 together. As you can see, the percentage of participants who correctly grouped similar arguments. The procedures didn't matter, which is good news. And then you can see here that if you put all arguments together, then you can see that 62% of the people were able to correctly group similar arguments together, which is significantly more than half of the people. It's not much, but it's not too bad. You can see that people are better at this task when it's the general ad populum argument, and when it was the position to know argument, almost only 1/3 accomplished this task. So this is it's more difficult. It's more difficult for the position to know arguments than for the ad populum arguments. So people are fairly good to at least group together the 2 similar arguments. And the second part had to do with linking the critical questions to this different subschemes. Are they able to group together critical questions that belong, that are related to the scheme? And here we analyzed the percentage of participants who correctly included relevant questions, and who also, because that's also good, correctly excluded irrelevant questions. So you get a point for a good question, and you also get a point if you don't tick an irrelevant question. So this is actually, the task is simple, but the analysis is difficult. Not so much the statistical test, but how do you actually determine, given the sheet with all the marks, whether this is sensible or not, or how sensible is it. It appeared to us that this is actually pretty, for us at least, pretty difficult. But given this selection, we determined that about half had 0.49 and 94% for all arguments. So half of the people were able to correctly link critical questions to schemes. And if you then do the analysis for each of the 6 different arguments, then you can see again for a populum, people are relatively good at linking relevant questions to this type. But for the expert opinion at populum, which is a very interesting case, it's much more difficult. So conclusion for the second study, maybe fairly good as to positive, but there is fairly good, maybe you could say relatively good, taking into account the difficulties with the schemes, but they're fairly good at correctly grouping together arguments from the same type, and arguments that had different topics, so they had different structures, so they were at least able to do this more than 50% of the time. So this gives additional support for the fact that people, that it's not only that people have those tools to evaluate, but that also they can use these tools maybe to see that some arguments are more similar than others. But this, we analyzed it very simple. Our analysis was simpler than we initially thought, maybe, that we just wanted to see whether people use the same 2 arguments. If you really want to find a distinction in groups that's correct, I mean, none of them did it correctly. The task of associating the questions to schemes was much more difficult for participants, but it's difficult to say whether this is actually not so good or actually amazingly strong if you realize that the sub-schemes are so much similar sometimes that it's actually, can you blame participants for their behavior if the starting point is difficult? So this is an interesting question. As you remember, I just had some issues with the schemes to start with. So if theoretically you're not sure whether some sub-schemes are really different, why would you expect people to differentiate between them or to see them as more similar? And also raises questions about that we just analyze whether people used critical questions that are relevant. But it's sometimes, if you take a close look at those critical questions, it seems that some critical questions are more relevant than others. Once we know if there was to be a ranking of the critical questions, then we could address the question whether people also pick the most relevant critical questions. So maybe people are actually better at this task than we now seem to determine, but at least it gives food for reflection on how people relate to 2 schemes. And there is definitely room for more research, I think, in this area, which I hope nicely combines a cognitive perspective, the empirical study of reasoning with arguments, with the very strong humanities perspective on the different contents of arguments and lists and catalogs. So that's why these are not the 2 final studies I won't do in this area. So as a sort of a summary, so people have a capacity to reason with the different schemes in mind. And so there is now less implicit or more explicit evidence that people have some sort of tools in their mind to make sense of arguments they encounter in real life. And that they are at least able to recognize some similarities between similar arguments and difference between different arguments because of their of the representations of argumentation schemes. Yeah. Room for questions.
Thank you, Jos. Thanks a lot for this very, very clear, informative, and insightful talk. The room is open now for questions. If you have a question or a comment, please raise your virtual hand. For those who are following us on Facebook, you can leave your questions as comments on the live stream, and I will voice them out here in the Zoom. So, questions, remarks from people who are here in the session. If nobody has a question, I could.
Yeah, I see 4 hands in the list.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, Eric. I can see Eric.
I think Florian was first.
No, Eric.
Okay, but I give you floor, Eric. Go, Eric.
Okay. So thank you very much. That was a really interesting talk. I have a kind of dumb question, to be honest. So I mean, argumentation schemes, as far as I understand, they are still they are normative, right? In a sense, maybe not as strongly normative as approaches in more logical approaches, but still the critical questions are supposed to give you some kind of, they are critical questions. So since they are normative, so if you have a normative methodology, you would expect that not everybody is following it already, because otherwise why come up with it? So why come up with argumentation schemes if everybody uses them as a toolbox already? So your result, in a sense, what does it confirm? It confirms, it seems to me, that to some extent people are using something like argumentation schemes or using some types of, can identify certain kind of types of argument, which is not very surprising because they are arguers and they argue, but then some don't. And similar studies have been done in logic. You probably know that, and you get similar results. You get sometimes people reason logically and sometimes not. So the question is, what do you really mean by a cognitive representation of an argumentation scheme? Because it cannot be, it's clear that it cannot be one-on-one. It cannot be that everybody has a cognitive representation of every argument scheme. That would be an incredible feature of argumentation schemes, that they are cognitively adequate in that sense. So the background of the research is not clear to me.
Yeah. I mean, so I think you raise a good point, and actually it's also the starting point of the idea for these kinds of studies. It's because the field, maybe to start very generally, there is very large distinction between the two fields I identified. So there is this large community of argumentation scholars in humanities, which most of them think belong to, and we generally are interested in trying to understand what arguments people use in reality, and we've noticed probably with the old Greeks that not every argument is unique, but there are cases of arguments that actually belong together. And so the argumentation schemes perspective very nicely aims to identify the types of arguments that we as humans appear to use, and that some arguments may be related. So there is a family of sub arguments, and Jean has made a couple of years ago started a very good project on identifying factors or reasons or elements of how to combine and these argumentation schemes in a very innovative way. So you can study argumentation schemes for, let's say, 30 years without even thinking about what people do with the argumentation schemes. And I wouldn't say you should. There is no intrinsic reason why you should also take into account how people use these schemes, but you can just, as main aim, try to make an inventory of schemes and see how they relate to each other. And then from the other field that's relevant today, cognition, cognitive science, cognitive psychology, people in those fields try to understand how we as humans reason or use information or reflect about contradiction or value new information. And there is a point where the two fields connect. But the methodologies used, the theories, the aims are so much different, and I really try to combine in both fields to address the question as is the case today, that it's combining or looking at how people reason with arguments is not so much, can be seen as an answer to addressing the question whether the schemes that exist in theory, I mean, they exist because we can see they exist. We have made formulations of schemes, catalogs, and it actually means that they exist because we believe them to be relevant. We made sub-schemes, we made critical questions, and we do this because we think it's useful maybe to learn people to argue better or to take into account critical questions, to help people to make sense of the world around us. And so the other perspective of what people actually do has to do with the idea that if schemes are so important as tools to evaluate arguments, do we also have as humans in our minds tools? We can mention tools that reflect schemes. It doesn't mean that they are not schemes. I mean, there is nothing in our computer that says this is a scheme or this is scheme 5B. There are critical questions 1, 2, 3 that you have to use. Unless you are a teacher, then you don't have cognitive tools, but you just have the lists in your mind because you have studied those those argumentation schemes. But the question here is whether is there anything, can we suspect people to have basic knowledge or basic tools in their minds to evaluate arguments that are sometimes similar and sometimes
so before they have learned argumentation schemes, have you also considered testing before and after?
Yeah, but I mean, that's a fundamental question. As I just said in the beginning, it's if we already see that 2-year-old children can distinguish between reasonable arguments and circular arguments, I don't suspect 2 years old to use tools that reflect argumentation schemes, but maybe at 4 years old they do. And the only reason why we are able to do this is because we learn from what we see. We get information, you see your parents reflect on or articulate what they think about information that we call an argument, or what someone comes in and says something and your mom says that doesn't make sense because blah, blah, blah. Then we learn this by doing. So there is a very strong case for that there must be something that we use that reflect argumentation schemes. And for me, I tried to come up with a study that more explicitly shows that actually when we encounter different arguments, that when you ask people, what do you think of the argument, that what they by themselves observe for that argument has to do with something that we, with our knowledge, see as a characteristic of this specific type of argument. So if when you say it's not surprising, then on one hand side that's true, because if we weren't able to do this, then maybe the schemes didn't exist. But still, you can say that all these people had normal training because they went to school, but they use this. They must have heard this so often that they made this connection between what they see and what they have as elements. So it makes sense. It's actually a non-result, but on the other hand, I think, and that's more my side, I think it's very interesting to see that we as humans are able to pinpoint actually the most relevant characteristic of a specific argument. And maybe the tools, as we call them tools, that we just saw in that table are specifically the most relevant issues that people use to evaluate arguments. And maybe they must exist because schemes are predicted to exist. But still, I think you have to determine whether that's empirically the case.
Okay, thank you, Jos. I give the floor now to Florian.
Yes, thank you, Dima. Thanks for your talk. I don't want to refer to the experiments because I think, well, these are brilliant experiments with a lot of data. You put a lot of effort in this. Like Erich, I rather want to refer to the presuppositions of those experiments and to the conclusions, and maybe then in the end draw like a slightly different conclusion from them. So so yeah, so you make the assumption of cognitive representations of schemes, and you presented the questions whether people have them or whether they don't, and well, this is underlying your experiments. This question, I would put this question a little bit differently and ask, what does it mean that people have those schemes or they don't? Why? Because of course we all agree that there must be some cognitive basis, right, for this. So it's not coming, or it's not based on nothing, right? We have organs, we have the physical conditions. But can we conclude from this that those cognitive representations of schemes are manifested, and especially the understanding and the meaning that is involved in giving and taking arguments is manifested in the physical conditions, so that we can reduce one to the other? I don't know whether you are familiar with Wittgenstein's Spiegel-in-the-box argument. So this argument actually shows that the meaning of words and sentences is not in the head. So I would, based on this argument, I would make the point that that arguments and the giving and taking of arguments is not reducible to those schemes that are in the head, right? So we had this discussion already with Chomsky and the universal grammar. Now it seems to come up again in terms of argumentation. So my conclusion that I would draw from your experiments would be in that way, that I would say, well, so how do we make sense of the understanding of giving and taking arguments and the arguments themselves? And it seems that the meaning that is involved there is much more based on social practices. And there also it makes total sense what you said, that we have to learn what those meanings are. We have to learn how to use those arguments, and perhaps 2 years old start to learn that. But that doesn't mean necessarily that they build something in their head. I mean, they learn something that is no doubt somehow based on physical preconditions, but the conclusion that you're drawing doesn't necessarily follow, I think.
And so following up on what you said, the last sentence, so the conclusion was, so it doesn't automatically follow. What would you see as the conclusion?
The conclusion that our practices of giving and taking arguments and arguments themselves are based on argumentation schemes that are manifested or that are physically manifested in the head, and that, you know, we can reduce one to the other.
Yeah, I think this is actually you saw on the slides, is a fundamental question. So whenever the question is fundamental, it's also philosophical. And it's hard to determine, to empirically determine, because we only measure output. So the output was what people said. It was recorded and coded. So, and we then analyze what people say. So one point that's definitely true is we only measure what people say. We don't measure what they think. We only measure what they say. It was think aloud. So we suspect that most of what they were thinking they said, but we can never be sure. So the point is not so much that whatever we do with arguments is automatically or is specifically argumentation schemes. It's more the fact, or the idea that there has been this community also starting with restorations on the idea that some arguments are more similar than others, and we try to catalog them and understand them, and that's in itself useful. But how does it relate to what people actually do with arguments? And one of the reasons why we study argumentation schemes is that some of us, or most of us, are also having this aim of educating people. If you want people to make more sense of the world, to make good decisions or better decisions every day, we have to help them, and we have to say, well, if you encounter these and those arguments, if you use these questions, and then you are in a better position to make sense and to make it better, and then you help people. And the idea is that people, so the idea is that people don't have these information. People don't know how to do this because otherwise they would. So this also makes for a case, I think, for the question: what do people, what kinds of tools do people have to make sense of arguments? People have different tools. People can let's say, people can still assess the quality of an argument based on whether it's new or whether it's old information, or whether the source that gives the argument is someone you trust or not. So, I mean, there are many things that people can use to assess arguments, but the question here was, can we also make a case? Can we also determine whether people have reflections of what we suspect to be important when you analyze arguments, such as comparability of cases or causality? Yeah.
And just to jump in there briefly, my point was exactly those criteria are not physical criteria as you want to claim. They are not in the head. They are socially and depend on social practice, agreement, and disagreement, and they're also Eric's point with the normativity, I think, comes in. This normativity is not, the sources of this normativity are not physical sources or chemical sources, they are social sources.
Yeah, I think that the question is, I'm not qualified to say. I mean, I'm not qualified. I mean, the same as if you show people a boat and a car, and you say, "What do you think of these two pictures?" Then most people will say, "Well, this is a car, and it's what they are dissimilar." So that would mean that people are able to distinguish forms. So then, and I think we agree. And then the question is there? You could say the tool of comparison is something that people can do. So, and if your question is how to articulate what comparison means, do people have a box that says comparison in your mind? Does it exist? But at least you can see that the output shows that people are able to use the issue of comparability in terms of what they do with the information. So I think I can still conclude with this research that people that people have such notions, and the question is where are they, or how they are formed. I don't know. That's something for later, but at least we can show it because of the output. It was a simple question: what do you think of the argument? We didn't ask them to say check the credibility or think about. So they came up themselves, but themselves doesn't mean that there is something growing in their mind independently. That's all based on because we live. So it's a very interesting question you raise, also very much fundamental, and I don't see it as something that this confirms the output of the study, but it's actually going further and thinking about what does it mean having a notion true. Yeah, good point.
Okay. Andres?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I have a general question, and then would lead into a more precise question about the results. So I was a little confused about the hypothesis 1. Mm-hmm. So if you said something like, if schemes are irrelevant, then we expect people to evaluate each argument in a unique way or something like this. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if you were thinking that people would evaluate each argument based on just completely, properties completely detached from argumentative properties, or on argumentative properties, but that did not pick out on the precise property of the argument. Like the argument was from analogy, and then people would respond by making reference to authority or something like this. Mm-hmm. So that's a general question. Maybe I guess you can answer this, and maybe I can.
Yeah, I think the first that's either if you suspect argumentation schemes to be in some way, maybe physically or not, present in our mind, then we should see a reflection. And if there is not, if these notions are unknown to us, then we would have other ways to assess arguments, maybe length, or there could be anything except issues related to argumentation schemes. I don't know what. I mean, some people may assess arguments because they because of who says it. I mean, if you say, well, if the argument is in a specific newspaper or program, you can say, I don't believe it because it's Fox News. I mean, so that people can have all kinds of ideas of why they argue, why they assess an argument, but if you don't find anything related to the issue, to notions that we can see or related to the schemes, then people don't have these notions, and people can, and the idea of schemes is that although arguments are all unique, they belong to classes, and that for each class, at least some of the notions may be more relevant than others, and results.
I guess maybe I can express my puzzle in a little bit in a different way. It's just that if you ask people, what do you think about this argument, or what do you think about this claim?
Yeah.
I don't see how. I think the natural answer will be to say something about whether it's true or whether it's credible or something like this. Mm-hmm. And I don't see, I mean, that seems very obvious in a way. I don't see how this connects to the more precise question of, do we have argument schemes?
Yeah, okay, yeah, so so the design of the experiments is actually very simple, but it's the more simple it looks, the more difficult it was actually, because you can easily ask too much or ask to be too precise. If you ask, what do you think about an argument and why, you would actually say to you need to have a reason to evaluate an argument. So that's why I conclude that the most simple answer would be best. So the very simple, or maybe stupid question, what do you think? I mean, some people said nothing. I don't care, or I don't know. These answers were also given. But if you just take a look at the table, you can see that most people said something about what they thought about the argument, good or bad, or interesting or not, and similarly about the claim. But also, and in most cases, they gave reasons for why they thought this argument was nonsensical or very strong. And they said, well, I think it's a good argument because the person put forward is an expert. And I didn't ask about that person. And that's I think the strength of the results lies in the fact that the question was so simple. We didn't want to have people reflect. They did it themselves, and they came up with answers that reflect what we think are relevant issues because of the argumentation schemes exist.
I wanted to ask something else about the results, but I think I can wait until everyone has asked that question.
Okay, so I put you on another again on the question list, Andres, and I ask Marcin to pose his question.
Thank you. So thank you, Jos, for a great talk. I really like that kind of work, and in a sense, I have two questions, and in a certain way, they are follow-up questions to my colleagues here in Lisbon. So Eric, Florian, and Andres. So, of course, none of us has. So this is the difficulty of presenting a very detailed empirical study. So none of us has read the complete study. It's like the vaccine, you know. We heard the news, but we didn't see the methodology. So I have two questions that are in a sense related. So one is exactly, in a sense, follows up on directly on Andres by coincidence, is about isolation of independent variables. So you mentioned in study one that you asked about the claim, and it's very well known in the psychology of reasoning in empirical studies that there is a confusion in evaluation between the truth of the conclusion and the quality of argument. So, for example, people evaluate better invalid syllogisms with true conclusions than valid syllogisms with conclusions that they disagree with, not even if they are, well, that they think they are not true, so they disagree with, okay? So here you didn't say much about this part of, at least in presentation, when you were asking people, because I understood, empirically speaking, that you did ask this question about their attitude towards conclusion, to kind of test for this alternative hypothesis there is a contamination from the evaluation of the conclusion rather than the evaluation of the scheme or at least the structure. So this is my first question. How you control this? Because again, I can imagine that, and also what Andres meant. So for example, maybe people carve out not exactly the scheme, but maybe there's some kind of grammatical structures, which of course would be related, or you might have alternative hypotheses here that explain why people group them together, for example. And it's not exactly the psychological reality of the scheme, but something other that is maybe related or maybe not. So maybe I stop here and then I ask the second.
I think that's better, yeah. So thanks for the question. Yeah, so your question is, well, did I control for people's prior attitude towards the claim? That's actually maybe a summary of the, and I didn't.
Yeah.
And I didn't for, we usually do for other studies, because if we want to know whether people are sensitive to the quality of arguments, if you don't know what people think about the claim, then you're not measuring the good thing. Yeah? Specifically, as you say, Martin, if I can suspect people to be not sensitive to the quality of arguments if people already find the claim good, relevant, and in the same case if they don't think the claim is useful. But in this case, so some people, we used claims that are not interesting to people, so general claims about specific measures or specific cases in reality about sport or exercising or education. And even if all claims had to be highly irrelevant or highly relevant, everything in between, people were free to say this doesn't make sense, or people say I agree. Some people say I agree. I think this is really important because blah blah blah, and it's important. This argument makes a good point because as I see it, indeed the comparability between the two cases is strong, and the latter part is the most important one. This person then said something about the fact that the case in the claim was identical or similar to the case in the argument. And that's what the study was about. It's not so much about measuring whether people agreed or not. I mean, I can easily compute whether how positive people were about the claim correlates with how positive people were about the argument. And it's interesting, I can easily compute that. And I wouldn't be surprised, as were you, to see high correlation. But whether there was a correlation or not, and I can control statistically for that. But the main issue is whether people can use those notions to make sense of what they think about it. And you can use the issue of comparability both when you agree with the argument or the standpoint, or when you disagree. You can say, well, this makes sense because they are similar. You can also say, this for me it doesn't make sense because it's dissimilar. And I didn't check for this, I don't know, but it's likely that some people agreed with the same standpoint, saying this makes a good point because, let's say, the Netherlands is highly comparable to Portugal. And other people say, well, this doesn't make sense because Portugal doesn't look like the Netherlands. And they both use the same element that I was interested in, namely comparability. Whether they use it to reach a positive or a negative conclusion doesn't matter.
So just a little follow-up. I will keep my second question for the second round if there is room, but still here. So okay, this acceptability or attitude towards claim is very important. So I understand maybe it's less important in that kind of study. Well, it's very important in the line also of Mercier-Sperber, because if you agree, you don't scrutinize the argument. So you have also a different, well, you understand that very well, you presented that. But here still, I would say again, so you presented very quickly in Dutch the examples. How did you control for, let's say, the linguistic shape? Because let's say the, generalization would use the same linguistic indicator. So the claim would have so typically, so you have this indicator war, and maybe people just orient to this, so to kind of superficial linguistic structures and what is called indicators of argumentation, rather than to schemes as kind of reasoning boxes, or you understand. So how did you control for that? Because of course, it's very difficult because it's typically in language that, you use, well, obviously for analogy, for causal arguments, for generalization, you use specific linguistic devices, but do you have anything to control for that?
To reassure, in the sense that, so I use the three different genres to not be able to draw conclusions about, let's say, only simple argument with a claim, but also a discussion, a dialogue, and also a news report. So those were different verbalizations of the same issue. And I wanted to create variability between the topics and the information, because otherwise people will see the same thing and maybe recognize. But imagine if it had been the same 12 times in a row. By definition, a different operationalization of a different scheme is articulated in a different way, but none of the arguments. I mean, if you say that someone puts forward a standpoint, and the other one says, why do you think it's relevant? And the other one puts forward, because this professor thinks it's true. The fact that he used the word professor it can be seen as an indicator for people. Okay, we have to think about credibility, and it's impossible to leave out that word, because then it's not an argument by authority anymore. So by definition, yes, you're right. There are indicators, but these are indicators of the argumentation scheme in itself. And still, people sometimes made a reflection about sufficiency or relevance in this example. But most, almost twice as much participants said something about that characteristic as being something that they came up with when they evaluate the argument. And I think it's if I had asked, what do you think of the argument and why? Then people would have said, I think it's good or strong or weak, and then they had asked them directly to come up with an argument for why they think it's strong, and I didn't. I think it's still a good. I'm really convinced that it's actually good for the results, because now I only ask, what do you think of it? And some people said, I agree, or I don't agree, but others by themselves were motivated to say something about why they thought it was good or bad. But I think you have a good. The first question was also very strong, because I can still check whether people who agreed with the claim used those notions less. So as you say, you can suspect people if they agree that they don't care about why they agree. So if we find the same percentage of participants using those notions for claims they agreed with as for claims they disagreed with, it makes an even stronger case for the use of those notions, actually. So that's a good point. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll take the floor for the next question. It's actually related to the relation between the two studies. Yes. So I can see that in the first one, people scored quite well on like saying the keywords that were associated with the different schemes, which was taken as an indication as that they reasoned with the scheme. So like they knew when it was a pragmatic argument that it was pragmatic, even not if not technically, because they referred to desirability, probability, and these kind of things.
Yeah.
And that's reassuring. And then like the second part of the second study, when they were asked to connect critical questions to the different schemes, they did not do that well. And this seems to me like it kind of points to the opposite direction. So on the one hand, intuitively, they could think of the considerations that are specific to each scheme, but they couldn't. Of course, they're not the same people, probably. The schemes presented are different also. But the second study suggests that the normal people could not make the connection between the relevant questions and the scheme used. So I was curious to know more about what you think about that. But also thinking like, did you control in both cases that there were lay people, not people that had education in argumentation? Can that be one of the factors affecting the result?
I think it's a good question. So the two studies were designed independently, so never with the aim of presenting them together, but for the occasion of today, I thought they all can be headed under the umbrella of argumentation schemes put to test. And so that's the reason why I combined them today. And they both have to do with what people do with argumentation schemes, but you're right that they are in a way very different. And the first one is a very fundamental one in the sense of, do people have those tools in their mind? And the second one is actually, if you said for the second study, it's not fair to see whether people use sub-schemes or critical questions, because we don't know whether theoretically we are right, then actually I would say I very much agree with you. So given the problems associated with the schemes and the sub-schemes, and whether the relevant questions are relevant or accurate, or whether they belong to the same questions or not, there is many work to do in this area. So actually we compare people's output with a starting point that's under attack, so to speak. But you can still do this and see. So that's why the only difficulty of this comparison is that if you have results, that it's too easy to say that people don't make sense of sub-scheme sets. So it's difficult to assess the results for the second study. So I'm relatively optimistic for the first part of the second study, saying that people are sometimes there is a minimum of people who are able to combine the two arguments of the same type, which is actually pretty good, given that those 6 different arguments are from the same class. They all belong together. So the task was difficult. You can imagine if we gave people arguments from authority, arguments from causality, and an argument from testimony, that it's more easy for people to differentiate between the 3. So the task of the second study was relatively difficult, indicating that the results didn't show that most people were successful, but doesn't show that people are not successful. So the second study is actually a sort of can be taken as, I mean, whenever and I think I will write a paper on the second study, it will never have the same background as the third study. The second study is actually more evidence for the fact that if the starting point is that people actually can make sense of argumentation schemes, see study 1, the results of this study actually underline some of the problems with the argumentation schemes as we now have, because how can you expect people to differentiate between sub-schemes if it's because the schemes are not so much different sometimes. So you're completely right that the first and second study have something in common, but are very motivated differently. That's correct. Yeah.
Thank you. We still have some questions, so I'll leave the floor now to Jorge, then Mali, then Pedro, and then if you have time, we can go back to the people who have a second question. So Jorge.
Thanks, Dima, and hi, Jos. Thanks for your really interesting talk.
Thank you.
And my question goes also in line in what Florian, Martin, and Dima were asking. And when I was listening to your presentation, I was wondering about the demographics. If you're considering the demographics of your participants, in the sense that, as Dima was mentioning, that people that receive education argumentation will be more identify argument schemes easily, and also taking consideration to what extent, like that the story takes place only in the Netherlands, which is a country with or like the education of your participants. To what extent that will limit the scope of your results, no? And if you would, I think it would be interesting to also replicate the experiment in to consider the cultural variation in this scheme product, the argumentative scheme production, because I think that's I don't know if you considered that also in your study or not, but I think it's also important to take into consideration. And so just like this comment, question, remark.
Yeah,
Thank
good
you.
point. I think, yeah, especially when you want to study potential cross-cultural differences and similarities, it's good to first have a good idea of how to study it within one culture, because otherwise you do things together. But it's definitely true that if you have a better idea of how people evaluate arguments or use those notions, then it's a next useful step would be to see how universal this is. So and you may be familiar with some of my work on cross-cultural variability. So I'm really happy to do this in the future, but I first have to find out to have a decent, so to speak, methodology to do this within a given culture, in my case, the Dutch culture, to see whether it works, and methodologically speaking, and then to transfer this to other countries. So if I see this as an invitation to do this in Portugal, feel free to contact me. And the first point about the demographics, that's a good point. I don't remember, I have to say this, whether we ask about whether they had experience in argumentation, but we did. The thing we made sure is that we didn't specifically had students participate to this study, because otherwise it's too easy to say that they have to do with argumentative texts every day or every week. So these were people with different educational backgrounds, from let's say 18 to 80, and we still have to analyze whether age or gender or educational backgrounds affected results, but at least the sample was made up of people with different ages and different backgrounds, so not so much limited to students, because we didn't want to do this with only students. And I think this is it's not the only answer, but it's one answer to your good question about the variability in terms of demographics. Yeah, because it's very much important here. Yeah, because if people are trained, and if you ask people this after training, you would suspect people to perform even better. Yeah.
Mali, you have a question?
Hi, thank you very much for this very interesting talk. Actually, my question was almost the same with George's, so I'm just going to slightly try to shift it. So first of all, you are an expert in this field. So what would your guess would be if you would somehow replicate this study in other cultures, let's say Portugal or like India, whatsoever? So referring particularly to, for instance, Weber's rationalization process, like would you expect less of findings in less, let's say, less rationalized societies? So would there be a comparative context here? And perhaps there are some findings that you could you could tell us about that could guide these expectancies. Thank you.
Yeah, I think so. In my other work, I think most of our reasoning with arguments is universal, and there are some small differences. I think that would be my main prediction. So I would suspect that the instruments, the notions that people have to use are universal. But the fact that it could be that some people in some cultures use some notions more easily than others, but it's difficult to predict. But I don't think it has to do anything with, let's say, rational countries, or you did say irrational, but I mean, so there is this culture, this East-West divide, and studies have shown that it doesn't make sense that even that also in China or India, people may come from different traditions, but reasoning with arguments in itself is a very universal aspect. So I wouldn't, again, it would be very useful to study this, but I think we have to find this out first in one given culture to be sure that the methodology works, and then to try to do this in different countries would be very much interesting. Yeah.
Pedro?
Hi. So thank you a lot for the presentation. I'll be returning to that initial line of questioning, but I'll be very brief. It's just, and I may have missed something because it has been a long inquiry, and you've answered to several questions on the same topic. I may have missed this question. If so, please excuse me, but what would falsify the hypothesis? I mean, what kind of results would show that there is no cognitive reality, no psychological reality to the argumentation schemes? Yeah. And especially taking into consideration that when you leave the participant undirected, it might simply be a case that the person is paying attention to something else.
Yeah. So if they, I mean, if they wouldn't have made reference to those notions as comparability or credibility, then of course you don't demonstrate that it's not the case. That's true. And your other question is, if let's say now 60% or so, or 70% made use of those notions, if it had been, let's say, 20%, then it would, then how to determine whether 20 is enough or not enough? That's difficult. But I mean, the good news is that the evidence is pretty much overwhelming, especially because if you look about that people don't use these notions altogether, but they use them depending on the different arguments that were used, and they use this more than the general informal logic criteria. So let's say, so that's also a baseline for it. That's why we also coded these criteria to make sure that the percentage of people responding in line with argumentation schemes, you need to be able to compare that to another basis, which is the informal logic criteria.
Next is Fabrizio.
Hello, thanks a lot for your presentation. My question is just curiosity, whether you know the relationship between the argumentation schemes and the argument schemata that are developed in cognitive psychology and educational psychology, because what you're doing seems to me very relevant. Schemata have been developed to improve students' reasoning, make it quicker, improving their writing. So my question is, you pointed out very clearly that there are many distinctions in the schemes that are not really intuitive. But I mean, developing in a science and organization, a classification based on this intuition could make the schemata that are nowadays used based on argumentation schemes like Nussbaum, for instance, much more effective also for the purpose of teaching and for an impact on students' education. I don't know whether this is the direction you wanted to go, or you have some thoughts about that.
I think at least have some thoughts about it. And I know the work of Nussbaum, and I think it's very good that people in education psychology make use of the results of our studies to try to inform students and to educate them better, as I said, to make better decisions, or maybe listen better to decisions, or the two together. So, I mean, that's good news. But I personally I'm not qualified, so to speak, as education psychologist I'm not. I mean, let's leave that for the education psychologists to try to invent and to design studies to make use of everything we know about argumentation schemes to see how we can have people perform better with these aims. My personal ambitions have more to do with understanding how cognition and how people's reasoning compares to what we as in the humanities think about those schemes, and how people should actually also reason. So they said it's a comparison between what people actually do, what people should do, and whether what people do is sometimes a reflection of what we hope them to do, and sometimes it's not. And why is that? And is that bad news? So that's my main interest in reasoning with arguments. And I hope with you, I know also that people in other fields, such as educational psychology, take up and then use our research findings and our empirical approaches to also see how people can be better reasoners. Yeah, good point.
We have a few minutes at our disposal still, and I know that Andres and Martin had second questions. So I'd leave the room to Andres first.
Hi, thanks. So yeah, so I mean, my other question was very much connected to Pedro's. So I was thinking of the study, the first study. So you got, if I remember correctly, for the analogy type of example, you got like 20-something% of people who made reference to this argumentation scheme. So yeah, so I guess my question was, first, what did the other 80% or 70%, okay, so you had the example and the analogy. So what did the other people say about the argument, the rest of the people, let's say? And then what is, how do you determine, I think this is probably very similar to Pedro's question, or even the same question. What's the threshold for saying, for having a good result? Because 27%, yeah.
Can you see, you can see, I think this
yeah.
Little now, yeah. So when there was nothing, there was nothing. So none of the people, none of the participants made reference to analogy when they saw an argument or from authority. What did they say? That's actually on the next slide. So most people, so let's say, except maybe one person, everyone made a remark about it's a good argument or strong, I don't believe it's the evaluation of the argument in itself. And then the third also said something about, I believe this claim, or I think this claim is irrelevant. And so people may have said both something about the claim and the argument, but also something about accuracy or sufficiency, and also something about a specific issue related to the argumentation scheme. So whenever you see nothing here, so maybe one person, I mean, everyone said something. So this all comes down to this last column. So everyone said something about these issues too. So that's the answer. And your second question is if these percentages would have all been 30% and the rest is blank, then you can say, well, 30%, that's not much. Only 1/3 of the participants said something about an issue related to this scheme, but still they do this much more than in other cases. So they do this not so much at random, but they use those notions specifically for the arguments that have been designed to say something about either authority, pragmatic arguments, examples, or analogies. So even if these potentials had been lower, they still made use of the notions specifically where we expect them to do.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Martin?
So again, I'm speaking about Andres, and I have a exactly follow-up question. So we're thinking, we're not in the same place, but we're thinking. So you also exactly this. I mean, I agree. Also, I think Pedro asked the question very clearly. That I think in general we are thinking that there might be alternative hypotheses here that you should kind of reason against them. You should have a strategy to disband them or undermine them somehow, because otherwise we don't know exactly what would falsify the study. But my question is super specific now, and so in the table that you just presented, there is a curious cross interference between example and analogy. So precisely, so in the example and analogy scenarios, people mention the criteria and also in authority, but just a little bit for the example scheme. And do you have any idea? I mean, yeah, there's a big debate since Aristotle, like whether analogy. So do we need? Can you move from particular example to another particular example, or do you always move through generalization and then analogy also interferes? So it's a classic debate between paradigm and sign and all this. And how can you? Yeah, or did you try to look into this somehow?
Yeah, a good point. I think so. The 22% and the 2. Let's specifically this one. And so this to us exactly. Many people said something about an example means that people said something about either it's only one case, that's not enough, or the case it's not representative, and comparability and representativeness are not mutually exclusive. So when you compare one example to the other, you can say that they are comparable or not, or more or less comparable. And when you have one example, that can be also comparable to the larger class of cases. So that's why, by definition, maybe it's not strange to see high numbers on the use of the issue of representativeness for analogy, because you can still, when there is one case, you can say, well, this looks like the other one, but also it's not. It's only one case, so it makes sense, because the two notions behind example and analogy are not so much the same, but they are related. Yeah. So you see this in the results.
Okay, so I guess for me, a certain curious but general theoretical result from these studies, assuming that all is fine and all is controlled, and we are super eager to see the published study, again, like with the with the vaccination, but is that so? You raise some points of criticism against the argumentation scheme theory, that maybe there are overlapping theories, so it doesn't fulfill certain criteria of strict classification, that they are mutually exclusive, jointly exhaustive and mutually exclusive. And then perhaps what you're saying is that in a certain folk psychology, people carry over this mess, so to speak, that the categories are overlapping, they are not so clear, and we have had this, 2,500 years of debates of how distinguish example from analogy, for example. Well, if you compare two individual cases, that's analogy, but why? But on the other hand, it's so, and it seems that people carry on this. So there is a curious result that I see in this, that somehow folk psychology, maybe that's what Eric was saying. It's just not logic. It doesn't fulfill certain clear criteria of classification.
It is also. It's just you don't have a specific question, so I'm free, I think, to say something about this issue. And that's actually one interesting question would be, who is right or wrong? I mean, I think as people with the information we receive and the way we deal with information, are we bad reasoners, or are we by definition relative? In most cases, we reason in a correct way, I think. We don't make we make mistakes. I mean, I'm the first one to make mistakes, but we all make mistakes. But in generally, let's say maybe three quarters of the case, we make good sense of what we see. So it's a very interesting question maybe to say whether the results of study 1 actually indicate what people do, And the second one actually says is what people do comparable to what we expect them to do. And maybe our expectations are wrong. And the problems we as a community have with how many schemes are there and how many sub-schemes, that's really intellectually interesting, but that's none of the business of people just in the streets. I mean, they're not in the streets, they're supposed to be at home in Corona times, but imagine we're all walking in the streets and go to bars and cafes. People who are there don't bother about this problem. And maybe the fact that they pinpoint to specific notions, as we saw in study 1, that's maybe the essential things that we should concentrate on, maybe, yeah? And that we, if we want to make the schemes idea simpler and maybe to reduce the number of schemes, that maybe a starter point could be, I'm not saying it should be, but it could be also saying what do normal reasoners do, and maybe that's just enough to tackle, let's say, 80% of being reasonable, and maybe growing from 80 to 90. You also should take into account this and that criterion, but that's just for the highly skilled educators. I don't know, reasoners. I don't know. That's interesting, I think.
Thank you.
I was ready to close the session, but I can see Eric has a question. Eric, would you like to ask a last question?
Yeah, just a quick question out of curiosity. How does this, so we're looking at theoretical arguments mostly, right? And not at practical reasoning exams. I was wondering during the talk, how does this relate to this research on cognitive biases and ecological rationality, heuristics for decision making? I think it's not clear to me what the connection is, but or if there is a connection. It seems to me that what you're interested in is really the slow system, right? What Kahneman and Tversky called the slow system, the cognition in the traditional sense, whereas the biases are probably biases of the features of the fast system. So, or is that the connection? Or?
Yeah, yes, I mean, so I think we could fill a whole afternoon about the two systems and whether that's correct and what does it mean.
Yeah, sure.
We can't do that, but it's an interesting question indeed. But I think it did so. These arguments were not so much theoretical. So they were in Dutch, but they could have been in the newspaper. That could have been a discussion you see.
No, that's not what I meant. I meant not practical reasoning.
Oh, so yeah, that's yeah.
Okay, so I guess this is time to end the session. Thank you so much, Jos, for being here with us virtually. I would like to thank everybody else also for being here with us today. Our next session will be at the end of January, and our guests will be Scott Aiken and John Casey. And because of the time difference, we're going to have our colloquium at 4 in the afternoon rather than at 11. But you'll receive the announcement. We'll continue also with the recording and the live streaming. So maybe this is the time to wish you all happy holidays and hopefully a healthy and happy New Year. So, ciao.
Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.
Merry Christmas.
Same to you.
Thanks, Jos.
Bye.